Welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining and participating in our September Brain Aneurysm Awareness Month information panel. We just thought it would be great during this time where we can't get together with each other and support groups aren't happening, to take this time to, pick some brains of some doctors, some researchers, survivors, and caregivers, and just share the information, have a nice conversation, and go from there. So thanks so much. Tom?
So thanks, Christine. Hey, everybody. My name is Tom Tinlin. I am the chair of the Brain Aneurysm Foundation Board of Directors. I'm also a brain aneurysm rupture survivor and also one of the lucky 15% that has a second aneurysm. So happy Brain Aneurysm Awareness Month, and kudos to the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, our teams, our partners, our volunteers, as we continue to spread awareness and advocate for resources to help us treat, and the medical professionals treat, this very treatable, survivable disease. So we're going to engage today in a little bit of a panel discussion, and we have some great people with us from both the medical side, the survivor and caregiver community side, and also the researcher side. So we have Dr. Chris Ogilvy, who is the founder of the Brain Aneurysm Foundation and the director of the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center here in Boston, Brain Aneurysm Institute. We have our survivor, Sharon Epperson, who is also a CNBC financial journalist. She will not be giving money tips today, but she will be talking about her experience as a brain aneurysm survivor. On the research side, we have Dr. Steffen-Sebastian Bolz, who is a professor at the Department of Physiology and the director of the Toronto Center of Microvascular Medicine, both at the University of Toronto as well. So he is also with the Quanta Pharmaceutical, which is another research company that's doing some really groundbreaking work in the field of brain aneurysm survivability and recuperation. Michael O'Leary, who is also a fellow brain aneurysm survivor, and just a huge advocate and a true warrior in this field. And then his dad, Joe O'Leary, which really helps give us the family perspective and the caregiver perspective. So with the groundwork now set and the foundation set, we're going to get right into it. So Dr. Ogilvy, the first question is for you. We hear a lot about the warning signs and the symptoms and the staggering numbers, which are 1 in 50 people across the planet have an unruptured brain aneurysm, and that's the best data available. We also know that an aneurysm ruptures every 18 minutes. So, I think really, an important thing for people to understand is who is the demographic, right? Who are we talking about? Who is most susceptible? And if you could share a little bit on the facts, right? What are the signs? What are the symptoms? Because we also know that misdiagnosis is a huge part of, I think, some of the mortality rate numbers. So with that, Dr. Ogilvy.
Sure, Tom, thanks so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Appreciate that the Brain Aneurysm Foundation is doing this. I know it's slowed a lot of charity efforts, a lot of efforts with the virus, the COVID-19 virus, but thankfully, Brain Aneurysm Foundation has proceeded ahead with Zoom support groups, meetings like this, other online interactions, and I think it's fantastic, and we need to continue that and push that, and appreciate the chance to be here. But to address your issue, there's a couple of things that you stated which are true, which is 1 in 50 people have a brain aneurysm. Now, obviously, not all these people go on to rupture, and that's where the conundrum comes. So that 1 in 50 number really comes from autopsy studies looking at patients with all kinds of disease who may or may not have died with their aneurysm. And what has happened is during the 90s, as the scanning got better, we started to see more and more of these aneurysms unruptured. The other way we see aneurysms, as you and Sharon know and Mike know, is with ruptures. That is when one of these things bursts, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But if you look at the total population, that's where that number comes up. And so we see a lot of unruptured aneurysms these days. When I started in practice 30 years ago, the majority of the aneurysms we saw were ruptured. Now, the majority of the aneurysms that we encounter in our neurovascular practices are unruptured. And the reason is scans are being obtained on people for all kinds of reasons. They bump their head, some appropriately for family history. I'll talk about that in a moment. But scans are obtained for lots of reasons, and the scans have gotten better and better, so they can see aneurysms and bumps on the artery down to a couple of millimeters. We then interact with those individuals and try to figure out, for the unruptured situation, who should be treated and who does and who shouldn't. And that's hinged on many factors: age of patient, size of aneurysm, location of aneurysm, whether they're a smoker or not. There's a number of factors that go into the decision making of an unruptured aneurysm as to whether we treat it or not. So we used all those factors, and about an hour and a half ago, I just finished coiling an unruptured aneurysm. It was about 10 millimeters in a gentleman who came in this morning and will go home tomorrow. And that's a very different hospitalization than a ruptured aneurysm. So for ruptured aneurysms, which is what some of the panel members here have experienced and you'll hear more about, the warning sign is the worst headache of their life. And that's the classic description. It's taught to us in medical school. It's taught to medical students and nursing students. And that's another thing that the Brain Aneurysm Foundation has been working on. We've been working with members from around the country to look at the curriculum of medical schools and nursing schools to be sure this is in the curriculum. Because a big piece of this is thinking about the diagnosis as a physician to identify patients with this problem. When someone comes in holding their head, screaming, saying they have the worst headache of their life, it's pretty obvious something's going on in their head and they end up with a head scan. The problem is it can be much more subtle than that. It might be the worst headache of their life for a couple of seconds, and then it feels more like a migraine, although they've never had a migraine. And they go to the emergency room and are told, well, maybe now you have a migraine. I've had people bend over picking up things and feel something pop, and afterwards they just have a little bit of a headache. So it can be an elusive diagnosis, and that's where the problem comes, is trying to figure out who has this problem. There, we're educating physicians in the emergency rooms and primary cares to think of the diagnosis, because if you can think of the diagnosis, there are scans. If you do a CT scan, and in some cases a lumbar puncture draining spinal fluid from the back, the lumbar space, you can identify a hemorrhage. But you have to think of the diagnosis, and it can be elusive. So when it's obvious, it's quite easy. But when it's more subtle, or they had their headache 3 or 4 days ago, and now they're coming to the emergency room because something doesn't feel right, it can be a more elusive thing to find. Now, you asked about demographics, and there's a couple of things there. One is family history. Aneurysms run in families. About 20 to 22%, up to 25% of our patients can have it in their family gene. And the way to find that out is when you meet a patient with an aneurysm, talk to them about whether their grandparents, parents, uncles, aunts had an aneurysm. And if they did, if there's 2 or more family members in the same bloodline, we recommend screening for the rest of the family. That would be brothers, sisters, and their children, and if it's enough people affected, their grandchildren. So the tree grows very quickly sometimes, but if you do that, you will find aneurysms in about 19% of the people in that family who are screened. So that's one big risk factor. The other is smoking. Now, particularly if you have a family history, smoking can accentuate the chance of having an aneurysm. Unfortunately, just as aneurysms run in families, smoking runs in families. So it's hard to sort of separate it out as a separate issue. We've been doing some recent research, and it's known for unruptured aneurysms that for whatever reason, some hormonal influence, whatever, about 70% of all the patients in unruptured aneurysm trials are women. 30% men. In ruptured situations, it's much more 60-40, 60% women, 40% men. Haven't really figured out why that is yet. Haven't really figured out why it's more common in women than men if you just look at a population of unruptured aneurysms. But we recently looked at women who smoke, and we have found a prevalence of aneurysms of 19%, very much like a familial situation. We have done 2 studies now, one from our center and one a multi-center study with 5 large hospitals in the United States and Canada that see aneurysm patients. And the same thing holds true, that women who smoke have a much higher incidence. So that may be something we need to push as an agenda to screen people in the future. We're not there quite yet. The other population that should be screened, that is when they're encountered, whether you know they have an aneurysm or not, patients with certain connective tissue diseases. And the most common is called autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, which is a big long word, which is very specific to a kidney problem people can have, but that runs in families. And when it does run in families, we recommend that family be screened for aneurysms because the chance of finding one is significant. So those are just some of the basics on the demographics of who we look at and how people show up when they come in for treatment or for diagnosis of an aneurysm.
Thanks, Dr. That's extremely insightful. I just want to dive a little bit deeper on one aspect of it. When you talked about, the worst headache of my life, and it might just be a fleeting headache, right? So what is the, what should the medical community be aware of, right? Because it feels like it's a little bit of a moving target. If the worst headache of my life yesterday, but now I'm in the emergency room and it feels like that migraine. So really, what is the message to the medical community?
So it is very much a moving target and very elusive. And in hindsight, when a patient comes in and the diagnosis is finally made, the residents and fellows say, oh my gosh, it's obvious they had an aneurysm. But sometimes if you're in an emergency room as a physician seeing, 50 or 20 headache patients a day, it can be hard to sift out who has the migraine and who has the aneurysm. That's why we ask those individuals, just think about the diagnosis of aneurysm. There's certain tests you can do to carry it through. The classic symptoms of an aneurysmal hemorrhage are worst headache of life, nausea, vomiting, stiff neck, and bright lights bother your eyes, what we say photophobia, which bugs, the light bothers your eyes. And then, of course, when it's a bad hemorrhage, these are people who collapse or in worse situation. The situation you addressed, which is the headache that goes, or the patient that kind of has a spell where they passed out for a minute, but then comes around and feels okay, but some things are not quite right, that's where it gets elusive. And that's where we bring in the diagnostic test of a CAT scan and a lumbar puncture to figure that out. But the person who encounters the individual patient, the physician who encounters the individual patient or the nurse, has to think about it. So the problem there, Tom, is it gets back to that this is a low frequency, high risk disease. In other words, some primary care physicians may see 3 aneurysm ruptures in their entire career. But if they know what to hear for, what to listen for, then they might pick it up. I see aneurysm ruptures every week, so it's easy. But because all I'm presented with is people who almost always have had the diagnosis made, although occasionally I've encountered people where the diagnosis hasn't been made, we made it. So that's where it gets tricky. It's easy to say if this is all you do and we're at this panel, this is all we're thinking about. But if you see it once every 3 years, we have to get that individual even awake enough and alert enough to know to think of this as a diagnosis.
That's extremely helpful. And I do think part of it is also, which I'm sure some of our other panelists will talk about, is patient self-advocacy, right? Is to your point, when things where they don't feel right, where something's going on. So that's great. So I do want to switch now. So, Stefan, so you hear Dr. Ogilvy talk about the importance of education, right? Both on the public side and even more so on the medical side. But in your case, there is so much, I think, advancement in the world of treatment and research. And I know that you and your universities are doing amazing work in these arenas. So what advancements have you seen? If you go back 3 to 5 years, Stefan, what are you seeing in the advancement of research and treatment options for patients?
So, Tom, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here, because this is wonderful for many reasons. Because first of all, it emulates what the Brain Aneurysm Foundation does with research meetings and with all those meetings where we got to know each other and where we know why we do what we do. So this is fantastic, and I also to kind of be able to bring the message and get the message across to more people than just us, I think is incredibly important. I always love, and I really love to listen to Chris, because I left neurosurgery in the mid-90s, which is 25 years ago, Tom, admittedly. But yeah, when I left the Department of Neurosurgery in Lübeck here in Germany, we mostly saw ruptured aneurysms. We didn't coil and we did not clip because we had very ill means and very reduced capabilities of targeting those people, of identifying the people, right? All these genetics, all these ideas about comorbidities were they took off at that time, but were they not fully developed, I think Chris would agree. It's all coming together now, and there was so much research being done that now helps us to stratify patients and to really know better whom to look after. The training got much better. I talk to my students in the Department of Physiology, the ND classes all the time about this, about the headache, the quality of the headache, and that they should be aware of this, because this disease has such an impact. If you ask me what has changed, I think Chris has covered a lot of ground there, and I try to support this because clinically we're doing so much better and so much more structured than we did before. We also do better with regard to kind of finding biomarkers for those aneurysms, for the prevalence of aneurysms. The question is, how do we find the people in the population? How do we look in people passing by and know that they have an aneurysm or not? Well, this will never happen, but somehow we need to get an idea about who's at risk. The next thing is, of course, we understand better what destabilizes the wall of the blood vessel, because in the very rare occasions you're born with an aneurysm. In most occasions, they develop over time. It's a continuum. It's a continuum from a healthy vessel to a very unstable vessel. So what happens there? And what are the conditions, the functional conditions that could hit that structure to finally burst? So could it be kind of blood pressure spikes? Hypertension is one of the comorbidities which are very problematic if we know you have an aneurysm, these kind of things. And then we get to the next question: how do we control blood pressure better in those patient groups? So this is all something that the attention has been developed for, and what people are working on. And we also got much better with rehabilitation. So what happens after the fact? So how can we get people back into a normal life? And that always impresses me, because I spent some time of my clinical career in the Department of Neurology and Psychiatry, and we actually had to deal with people who needed to relearn certain things after very different diseases, but some of them had a ruptured aneurysm. So how do we get those people back in life? How do we get them back into society and out of isolation? And I think we have made huge progress there. And I think the brain aneurysm played and continues to play a huge role in this. So kudos for that. It's very impressive. What we have focused on, and that brings me back to my very early clinical years, is what happens when an aneurysm ruptures. It's not just bleeding and not just blood flooding the brain, because as you can imagine, the brain is in the skull. So as soon as you open a blood vessel, the pressure in the blood vessel kind of goes into the skull. It's everywhere and compresses all capillaries in the brain. So what you need to do is, the first order of business is you have to get the blood out. And that is something that mankind has done for several thousands of years, right? So but that's only the first step. The decompression is important, but it's only the start. Because even if you do this, and even if people heal, what happens 4 to 10 days later is the second episode where these patients are at risk to develop disseminated strokes. This time not hemorrhagic stroke, but disseminated ischemic stroke. And the question that we had and the question I had for myself is, as a young resident in neurosurgery, what is happening there? And nobody could tell me. So I actually decided to go after this. And being young, I thought it would take 2 years. And look at me now. I'm not exactly young anymore. So it took a little longer, but maybe we have something to offer. So what we looked at was what was available, and Chris already kind of alluded on that. Imaging got better and better, and patients could get angiograms after the rupture. And what people could see is that large arteries started to constrict. That actually means they let less blood pass. And that would cause, of course, an ischemic episode in tissues distal from the vessel, right? So this is why people thought, well, if we could open that, everything should be better. And this is the idea behind nimodipine treatment. Calcium antagonists do undoubtedly do the job and open these vessels up. The problem is, this is not where it really matters, I would say. It really matters further downstream, in the very small vessels and the smallest vessels, because these vessels are the ones that direct blood flow, and that actually decide over which neuron gets blood because it's active, and which one doesn't because it's inactive. So this is a very delicate, very fine-tuned regulatory system. And what we found is, in very simple words, is that this system is massively affected after bleeding in the brain. And what we found out is that these small arteries that can either get larger to let more blood pass, or smaller to actually reduce blood flow for the benefit of another neuron that is working, that these arteries all constrict. And what we can see this in humans, but we can also see this, or we can actually calculate this in humans because you cannot image these small blood vessels. But we can very clearly show in mouse models that these arteries shut down. Not completely, but they are far too narrow. They have far too much resistance, and that reduces blood flow to the brain. And we then went after the molecular mechanism. We tried to understand what is happening there. And we looked at these small blood vessels in a lot of detail. These vessels have a size that is 6 times smaller than a human hair. So this is really small, 50 micrometers. So we cannulated them. With glass pipettes, we tied knots and we pressurized them and tried to make them happy as in the body to understand how they work. And we understand now what drives their behavior. Why do they, if pressure goes up in the system, why do they constrict? Because they need to constrict to protect the brain, otherwise the brain would see too much pressure. And why do they dilate if they need more blood to the brain? How does this work? We understand this, and we know that this very fundamental mechanism is compromised in SIH patients. And we also know all the players. We look at the molecular signaling, and we know how this increase in pressure that opens up the vessel first, how this makes the vessel constrict. What is happening in the cells? And we know which protein is compromised. And we could show that if we kind of bring back this protein to normal, then we have normal blood flow again, at least in mice. And now at this point in time, and this is why Tom mentioned the fact that we've also founded a company to make this translational step now from the clinic into the clinical application, because now it gets expensive and no one in the public domain would ever pay for this. So you need investors, and this is why we made this step. This now tries to show that with the means of treatment that we found, we can improve the outcome in SIH patients. And the good thing about this medication is it's already there. It's being used for children who have cystic fibrosis, and we can use this medication to treat SIH patients. At least in mice, it works. So this is a translational point. So now we need to prove now is what we see in mice, can we kind of repeat this in humans? And that's the big task ahead, and I'm really looking forward to this. We hope with everything to be ready to go live with this in next year, to really do the clinical trials, and we will see what happens then. And it's always a gamble, because a mouse is not a human and human is not a mouse. But we have to do it. There's no other way to find out about this. So this is what we do. It might have been a long-winded answer. I apologize for that, but this is
No, that's really helpful. And I think, the numbers, especially the post-rupture survival rate is really paramount, and the quality of recovery, right? So I think that's terrific. And I should also point out that, the research that Dr. Bolz is referring to is also in part funded by the Brain Aneurysm Foundation. We're also funding some programs in terms of the diagnostic piece for simple blood tests that could help show that whether or not an aneurysm is present, which would also be great, less invasive, and quite frankly, a little bit cheaper for folks. But, the next question, and based upon that, I do want to bring up the fact, and, shameless plug for sure for the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, but, the foundation, as the recognized leader of raising awareness and education, support, advocacy, and of course, research funding, everybody here on this panel, and many folks who aren't on this panel, have done a lot to contribute to the success of BAF and all of our noble goals. But, so I do want to really go down the line. And Michael, I'm going to start with you on this one, right? Because I see you everywhere the Brain Aneurysm Foundation has an event or a support group, or just whatever the case may be, that you and your family are always super involved. So why do you feel that your involvement with the foundation is so important?
Well, hi everyone. It's amazing that it's already been roughly 6 years since my brain aneurysm rupture. And as we all know, the brain aneurysms do not discriminate on age, race, or gender. So I like to kind of be the success story, I guess, from the terrible disease, because too often you hear of all of the individuals never fully recovering. And so I like to kind of shine the positive light that there is light at the end of the tunnel for survivors, caregivers, and all of their family members as well.
Well said. Well said. So and it's a team sport, right? So our family is huge, is just for us and who have had a rupture, who are recovering, for those who haven't had a rupture and are facing scary times with surgery and treatment. So Joe, why is it important to you and your family to be involved with BAF?
Well, thank you, Tom. Michael's brain aneurysm rupture changed our lives. We're fortunate that he's still with us here today. We're lucky that we live in the Boston area with having some of the best medical professionals and healthcare facilities in the world. We were the fortunate ones. There are roughly 6.5 million people in the US with an unruptured brain aneurysm, and many of them don't have the opportunity for healthcare that was available to us. Our family knows the hardships this disease can have on individuals and families, and we feel that we needed to do our part to give some back. After learning how little was known about this disease, we felt that we needed to help advocate, educate, and spread awareness on brain aneurysm awareness. Our involvement with the Brain Aneurysm Foundation helps our family share and connect our experiences with others who need support. Thank you.
Excellent. I appreciate that, Joe. Now, again, going right down the line, our friend Sharon Epperson, who is also just such a true champion of the cause, raising awareness and sending her very well-known voice to a much wider audience. So Sharon, thanks for all you do for the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, brain awareness and support and advocacy. So why is it important to you to be involved?
Well, it's important for me to be involved with the Brain Aneurysm Foundation because, frankly, it's through the foundation that I found out really what a brain aneurysm is, what it does to you, how you recuperate from having had surgery after a ruptured brain aneurysm. When I had my aneurysm rupture in September of 2016, my biggest question in ICU and for months after was, why me? What did I do to deserve this? How did this happen to me? And as I was looking for answers, which, there often really aren't answers to questions that are big like that, but there are some scientific answers, and some of them have been given. One, I'm a woman. Two, I was 48 years old in the demographic age-wise where this could happen. I'm African-American, and African-American and Latinos are twice as likely as whites to have an aneurysm rupture. And then also, as Dr. Ogilvy pointed out, I have a family history, which I didn't really pay attention to. I knew that my grandfather had passed away from a brain hemorrhage. I knew that my aunt had passed away from a brain hemorrhage. I didn't think about brain aneurysm being tied to that and the reason why. And then I later found out, as I was in recovery, that my great-grandfather, also all of these relatives on my mother's side, had passed away from a brain hemorrhage. So I am in that 25% that's more likely to have an aneurysm, and I didn't know. But I learned all of these facts from going to bafound.org and figuring it out and looking there on the website and using that as a resource. I went to my neurosurgeon. I said, is there some reason that maybe this happened to me? Are blacks more likely to get aneurysms? And he said, well, maybe, if their smoking is higher, I wouldn't be surprised. And this is someone who has been one of the icons in this field who had done at the time 2,500 clippings for brain aneurysms, but he wasn't really looking at the research. And that is what the Brain Aneurysm Foundation does in terms of funding research, but then also putting those facts on the website so that people can find the information. So it was critical to my recovery without meeting anyone from the foundation. Just learning and reading as a journalist, that's what I do. That was my greatest resource in simple language, in terms that I can understand, in information that I could share with my husband and my sister. It made me more comfortable about what was happening to me. They were hearing it in the hospital, in ICU, like Joe had to do for Mike. He knew everything as was going along. Once we come home, then we have to figure out what has happened to us. And that's where the foundation is so very helpful, and that website is so very helpful. I then had to set a milestone for myself as I was recovering, trying to walk every day, trying to get my head in the right space, just mentally, and the psychological kind of impact of having something so traumatic happen to you. And in that, in exercising and getting ready, I also was introduced to a board member who does a great race here in New York area, 5K race every year in honor of her daughter who passed away from a brain aneurysm. So the Team Cindy organization that works very closely with BAF has an annual race in September, and we just had one last weekend to raise money for research funding. It's called the Team Cindy 5K Run for Research. And I decided that that was going to be my 1-year anniversary goal, that I was going to try to be able to do a 5K. I was the worst grade I ever got in elementary, middle, and high school was gym. So I'm not an athlete, I'm not a runner, and I'd never done a 5K. But I did a 5K in 2017. I walked most of it and ran at the end, but I did it. And it was at that event that I met the board member in person. I met Elaine in person and got to really connect with someone who had lost someone, but to hopefully bring her some joy and hope about the lives that she's saving by the work that she's doing, raising money for research. And I also met Christine Buckley, who's the executive director of the Brain Aneurysm Foundation. And I realized that this is not just an organization that puts out data that has been compiled by great doctors and scientists like Dr. Bolz or like Dr. Ogilvy. This is an organization that's about family. This is an organization that says, I get you. I understand what you're going through. You're trying to figure out what an aneurysm is, and you don't want it to rupture. So you want to figure out how I get treatment or the right type of treatment so that I can live longer. You've had a ruptured aneurysm and you want to know, how do I recover from this? Well, there are people who are here on this call, people who are involved in the board, and people who work for the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, where this is what they think about and they do pretty much every day, most of the day. And it's hard to not think about it. And so that's why I'm so happy to be involved. People ask me, it's been 4 years, now aren't you over it talking about it? I think about it every single day. And I think about it with hope and promise now, not why did this happen to me? And now I think about it as, why not you? It had to be you. It happened to you because now you have a voice. You've recovered to the best of your ability at this point, and now it's on you to tell people what this is, why it's so important, and why they need to pay attention to something that is a silent killer, but does not have to be.
That's terrific. Every panel I've ever been a part of has a mic drop moment, Sharon, and I just that was a mic drop moment. Well said, and
Thank you
for all you do. I mean, you, Michael, and myself, we're miracles, right? And if we're not going to carry those who have not been as fortunate with us in the future, and hopefully save some lives, then you have to wonder then why were we spared and so many are not. But that was just extremely well said. So Dr. Ogilvy, I'm sure now you're probably standing over a patient because you just so looked the part today as a literal brain surgeon. The Brain Aneurysm Foundation is your baby, right? I think you and Dee Dee Buckley, your nurse practitioner in the Brain Aneurysm Institute at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, going into our 26th year, I guess, really saw this void of, I can't even imagine what the information was like almost 26 years ago, as opposed to where it is today. But your constant involvement and energy is truly something to behold. So why is it important to you to continue to be active in the Brain Aneurysm Foundation and also to chair the Brain Aneurysm Foundation Medical Advisory Committee? So tell us why it's so important to you, please.
Well, it's been hugely gratifying, is one of the greatest things. And you're right, when we started, there was virtually no information for patients and families, and there was no internet, so it was all printed information. Colleagues sometimes questioned me why was I doing this? Why were we pushing this? Now, people in those same positions, much younger than the colleagues who asked me those questions, are dying to get on the medical advisory board of the Brain Aneurysm Foundation. So you can see with time things change, but it's been incredibly gratifying, and it's really done more than we ever hoped. I'll tell you just a couple of things from the medical side. As you know, Tom, but maybe others don't, that the BAF has actually raised more money for research than any organized body, including the federal government or the NIH, to study specifically brain aneurysms. Sometimes that's written into other grants, but specifically for brain aneurysms, the BAF has raised more money than anyone, I believe, and given more. Now, it didn't just sit there and go to people who didn't use it. Those grants that were given, I know of at least 5 or a half dozen that have been the seed grants for subsequent NIH funding for larger studies, because some of these studies that we're funding and some of the studies that are funded are for instance, clinical studies, small numbers of patients. However, it's proof of concept, meaning they showed something works. Then you need the real heavy information from NIH, heavy funding from NIH to get more information to prove that point, and then it becomes practice. And that's been really gratifying to see that happen in a couple of situations. You mentioned earlier blood test for aneurysm. We would love that. It's being worked on. Who knows? It may or may not come totally to fruition or partially to fruition, but that's the type of thing that interests me in terms of this disease, in terms of finding who has an aneurysm and then going from there. So all of that has been incredibly gratifying. But what I still find, as of 7 minutes ago during Sharon's message, is that every patient and family has a story. They're all a little different. There's lots of similarities, as you've all found, but they all have a story that's really important to tell. And I realize this is true for many diseases, many different ways, but brain aneurysms are different. It's something that happens when they rupture for a fraction of a second, and then it then sets into motion events which last minutes, hours, days, years, as you're seeing, and affect not only the individual but their family members. So it's a little different. In medicine, there's not a whole lot of other things like that. A heart attack maybe, but a heart attack stays there. The brain rupture is for a second, it seals itself off. Then we've got to get that thing fixed and got to get it taken care of. But my part of taking care of that aneurysm is the first tiny little piece of a long story. So that's what's really kept me captivated over the years, really.
That's terrific. And the energy that you bring to the discussion after 25 plus years, or 26 year, I tell you, it's so refreshing. And I do think we in the survivor community and our families, we probably put a little too much pressure on you, because people just gravitate. In my experience, people gravitate to positivity. So thank you for all you do, and quite frankly, thank you for forming the Brain Aneurysm Foundation so many years ago and remaining active in it. Stefan, you, my friend, have benefited a little bit financially, but making the world a better place for those of us with brain aneurysms. And you too, and your team have been really involved with the foundation. So tell me, other than the money, all right, we get the money is important, but tell us why it's important for you and yours to stay involved with the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, of which we're so grateful.
Oh, many things. So one thing is when I just listened to Mike and Sharon, this is exactly what Chris says. I can only echo this. This is, and I said this before, coming to those conventions or these research seminars tells you, when you meet the survivors, tells you why we do what we do. It's so important to be grounded in that part of the spectrum. And I left neuroscience because I wanted to find out about this. And I sympathize with Chris asking, his colleagues asking, why do you do the Brain Aneurysm Foundation? Guess what I was asked when I left surgery for physiology, right? So actually, even today when I tell my CV, I get funny questions about why I did that. And I didn't tell anybody. I just went there because I wanted to know about this. And this is a long way. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And it's very, very important to always get back to the roots and say, okay, it really makes sense. Because my initiation, so to speak, was a young mother who died of DCI. And I was in charge. I was in the ICU, and there was nothing I could ever done, but she died. And I saw that, and I saw the kids sitting beside her. And this is something that is an initiation, but to carry this for a long time, you need to keep contact with this patient group. And even when you're in research, it's increasingly difficult. Chris actually sees patients all the time. I don't. So this is important. And to hear the stories and to really connect to the stories. My initiation with the BAT Foundation is several years ago, meanwhile, and I had never, ever experienced anything like that before. And that also relates to what Chris has said before. And I'll tell you why, because this is a meeting of researchers, of clinicians, and of survivors. And we have those discussions, we come together, we get to know each other. And every meeting I've attended, I could not attend the last two for very unfortunate reasons, but every meeting ended with a party. Not a wide party, but everyone partied and was so happy to be together. And I saw in Christine and her team how relieved they were that everything went so well. And this showed me how much they care. And I've never seen this in any other group. And this is a compliment to you, Christine, and your team, because This is unique. There is this, everyone wants to achieve a goal together. And this is an energy, Tom just mentioned, this is an energy, and this is kind of also something you subscribe to that will never let you go, right? So this is a little bit like Hotel California, you can check out, but you never leave. This is how I see this, right? So, and I think this is important. You need that. Otherwise, it's too easy to say, oh, let's do something else. And last but not least, I have to talk a little bit about the money, Tom. Last but not least, every grant that we got opened a new door for us. We could try things that we could not have tried under a CIHR mandate. CIHR is the Canadian NIH, so to speak, or the Heart and Stroke Foundation. It would have been too risky. You would have got all these feasibility questions, but we could go in there with an established animal model or whatever that the brain aneurysm helped us with. This is invaluable to make the next step. Otherwise, you could never actually get to the level which would be fundable. I find this very important. And this is for patient organizations, and organizations like the BAF Foundation have a very important role. Many things in research would not happen without you guys. That's an important message.
Terrific. Thanks so much. And, you know, I tease a little bit about the money, but let's be honest, you know, it's paramountly important, right? It's important for us as a community, the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, to advocate with our elected leadership on Capitol Hill in Washington. And over the last 10 years, we have, you know, before my time, but I have had the opportunity to go, have brought our message to Congress. And I do think, you know, it's important that we do that and put faces to the disease. Because as folks have alluded to, the Brain Aneurysm Foundation is the largest funder of brain aneurysm research. And there are a lot of other really horrible diseases that need some attention as well. But when you look at those numbers again, you know, 1 in every 50 people in this country, in this world, have an unruptured aneurysm that they know nothing about, and to Dr. Ogilvy's point, can change their life and the lives of everybody around them just in an instant. So I want to go to Christine, you know, who is, you know, just such a true champion, not just as the executive director, but she lives and breathes our cause every day. So Christine, in your opinion, what is the importance of bringing our message to us?
Thanks, Tom. Well, I mean, 2 things that I love the most every year working at the foundation is our research symposium, which unfortunately, like Steffen mentioned, you know, just that family, that coming together of researchers, patients, caregivers, even the corporate side that come and be a part of it. The same thing happens on Capitol Hill. So we started going there like everything else we do, just to raise awareness and to provide education. And then that grew over the years into forming some legislation, again, for research. But what happens on that day on the Hill, I mean, everybody, I mean, every time I go, and you go there knowing you're not going to leave there, oh yeah, sure, we're going to pass that for you, you know, job's done and that's it. But it's just bringing people. Last time we had 120 people from about 16, 17 different states. We are on target this year to be even a larger group than that. But it's just a time for everyone to come together to tell their stories and to humanize brain aneurysms to the people in Congress. And, you know, and everyone has touched upon that here, and why it's just important for everything that we do is to humanize it. You know, statistics are great, data drives a lot, but when you're sitting in front of your elected official, whether it be, you know, their legislative aide or the actual congressperson themselves, you know, and 99% of the meetings I have, and in the meetings that, you know, I'm a part of, I feel I'm the least important person there, because I'm not telling us a story of survivorship or caregiving. You know, I'm providing that data and a little bit of background of what we're trying to do. But to hear the people tell their stories and to see the reactions from the people across the table. And it humanizes it. We've touched people going back year after year, gaining a little more traction, developing Ellie's Law, working with some appropriations language. There has been growth. There's definitely been the recognition of who we are as an organization, but more importantly, what this disease is, how it impacts people, how it changes lives. And the fact is that brain aneurysms are treatable. So people need to know they have them. We need to prevent the ruptures and just get more funding for research. And I was fortunate yesterday I was part of a different advocacy group. It was Rally for Medical Research. So it was a virtual Hill Day. And I'm glad I did it for so many reasons. It got me back in that mode that, you know what, we have to get back, whether we're going to be in person or not in 2021, we have to get back in front of these people on the Hill. But one of the gentlemen in my group who was involved with ALS, you know, he was saying research is good for research. So, you know, there is crossover. So there is some crossover. If Alzheimer's or ALS is doing this, there might be something that can also tie into brain aneurysms. I think Dr. Bolz mentioned cystic fibrosis. Something there could also help brain aneurysms. So, you know, people have to just be open to really supporting NIH and getting the funding out. We're obviously there for brain aneurysms because we all know that the federal government only funds $2.08 per year per person affected. So, I mean, so much lower down the scale than any other disease. And we don't want to take away from other diseases, but we want a piece of that pie that's proportional for the people and lives that are being changed. So for me, it's just a great day to bring so many people together, to know we are educating the people on the Hill, we are making them more aware, and we are developing relationships that I think down the road will be beneficial, particularly for those doing research for this disease.
Thanks, Christine. And I do want to talk to the other panelists on this as well. But you mentioned in passing Ellie's Law. So if somebody's not familiar with Ellie's Law and they happen to be watching this, could you just explain a little bit on what Ellie's Law is and what it means to the community?
Sure, absolutely. Ellie was a young 14-year-old girl who died on her second day of high school. And her family became involved with the foundation in a law firm on the Hill, kind of partner who was friends with the family, reached out to us, and they helped develop Ellie's Law. And what that is asking for federal government funding for brain aneurysm specific research through NIH for $5 million for 5 years, so $25 million in total. So that legislation is there. I just found out yesterday we have some new co-sponsors, both Democrat and Republican. So again, I look forward to going back and working to get more support for that in 2021.
Thank you. And for those who may be watching this for the first time, how's that for a bipartisan issue, right? $5 million of once a year for 5 years, 25 total. I think we could find that in the seat cushions if we look hard enough. So I appreciate you doing that. Dr. Bolz, you had given me a virtual hand raise that you wanted to add a little something onto this. So why don't you do that for us?
I wanted to connect to what Christine did, because I've been involved with this kind of research for more than 20 years now. But now that we try to transfer our activities into the corporate world, we have to adhere to different rules and we have to talk a different language. And one of the primary language out there is money, to keep it very simple. And so what we had to do for the first time ever, we had to put numbers on this disease. And it is absolutely mind-blowing how expensive this disease is. So I just opened, not to tell anything wrong, I just opened the European numbers. So we have calculated the European numbers, and we have also the US numbers, but the Europeans are way easier to get and are safer. So in the European Union, with roughly 430 million inhabitants, we spend 9 billion euros annually for the disabilities caused by SIH.
Wow.
The problem with SIH, of course, problem in big quotes, is that it hits the patient at a young age, and the patients, if they survive, have a normal life expectancy. The social and economic impact, and we've heard this, is enormous. And I think, as much as I despise to put numbers on everything, we had to do it here, and I was blown away. SIH is probably the only rare disease where the criterion is to have under 5 patients per 10,000 patients that addresses a multi-billion-dollar market. And I think people need to understand this, because this is an expensive disease, and I think it's much more important to talk about the social impacts impact on families and so on. But if you talk to people in the political group who have to make those decisions, they should wake up and understand how much this costs. This is money we can spend on infrastructure, on schools, on education, and name it. I think that's an important fact. So that's the only thing I wanted to add, Tom.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And obviously, my pal Sharon Epperson, you and I met in DC. We had communicated before that, and we were talking about quiet corners and you know, the ability to support one another and the community as a whole. But why do you feel it's important, Sharon, for you to come down to DC with us, and however this is moving forward to advocate for things such as Ellie's Law? Are you muted?
I think it's really important to spread awareness, to raise awareness. But what I found to be so compelling being on the Hill is how many people, whether they're aides or Congress people, have encountered brain aneurysms already, but they think it's a death sentence. So they really explored what it is in terms of the money that Dr. Bolz has talked about that people are having to spend as they survive this disease, or people have to spend in terms of treating it so that it never ruptures. So a couple of the interesting conversations I've had are with Congress people who have dear friends that have had aneurysms and wanted to know more, wanted to hear our stories as survivors of how that happened and what the Brain Aneurysm Foundation is doing to make sure that there's more research and to help people who are surviving cope with just daily life. One congressperson said, who later signed on to Ellie's Law, said to me exactly what you said, Tom. This is pennies. $5 million? That's nothing. But what's really interesting is 18 months after I met with him, his brother-in-law had a brain aneurysm rupture, had a subarachnoid hemorrhage. So it hits people when they're not expecting it. And they know more than they think they know, but it's just so kind of low on the totem pole. We're just saying $5 million, and we didn't even think people really survived from that. I can't believe you're here telling us that story. It seems like a no-brainer that this is such a nonpartisan issue that every congressperson would sign on and say, yes, we support this. Of course, $5 million every year over 5 years is simple to do, but there's so much else they're dealing with. So I think being there as survivors, being there as caregivers, as people who are going through this, for them to hear our stories and really connecting that is your coworker, because there have been Congress people who've passed away from aneurysms as well. They can be your coworker, they can be your friend, they can be your family member. And we're just here to bring it home to you that we're just asking for this small amount, because $2 for each one of us is just not enough. And you can realize that. So I think it's really important that we're there to kind of raise awareness. And I hope that that more people on the Hill will sign on to Ellie's Law and will make September, you know, that governors also will make September Brain Aneurysm Awareness Month in their states, that we're just kind of just raising the awareness that there are people here that can survive from this. But we need your help so that we can get adequate funding so the Dr. Bolz, Dr. Ogilvy, researchers out there can do the research that is needed so that we can have more of a survival rate.
Well said. Well said. You must have been on camera once or twice, huh? Let's get rolling there. The O'Learys, Michael and Joe, why is it important for you guys to make the trek down to DC and tell your story?
So we've been probably, I think it's 4 or 5 years, 4 years. So years ago, like in our first few trips, we'd ask Congress if they've ever even heard of what a brain aneurysm was. And most commonly, the answer was no. So they may have mentioned a relative who may have had one, but they definitely seemed very uninformed on the facts backing brain aneurysm knowledge. So in our past visits, our message has definitely been heard, and you can see that they're starting to recognize this as we would make our yearly visits, and we're definitely being noticed more, which is very important in the whole foundation's goal.
I think, Tom, in our visits there, when we state some of the facts that we mentioned this before, that 6.5 million people in the U.S. have an unruptured brain aneurysm, that gets a reaction. Meeting state senators of Massachusetts and stating the fact that 136,000 people in Massachusetts alone have an unruptured brain aneurysm, that gets a reaction. When you meet a state representative and you mention to them that 14,000 of their constituents in their congressional district are affiliated with this disease, that gets a reaction. In the 4 years that Michael, myself, and my daughter Juliet attended Advocacy Day at Capitol Hill, we told our story and asked for support. We met familiar faces and feel that we were successful in delivering our message. It's not easy getting things done in Washington, but with the determination of the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, we're making small steps forward to raise awareness and increase funding for research. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Joe. And you know, it's so funny. I do think, well, I'll put it this way. So support, you know, you can categorize support in so many different ways, right? And we as survivors, you know, our needs are always different. The type of support we need is always truly different. So I do want to ask Sharon and Michael, you know, about the importance of being able to allow ourselves to receive support for ourselves and for our family. And then Joe, I'd love to get your take on that as well as a caregiver. So the direct question, Sharon, you know, what is the importance of getting the support, not just for ourselves, but also for our families?
Well, I'm going to talk about myself a little bit with the support for the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, because at this point, my family's very involved as well when we're raising money and raising awareness. But in terms of support and support groups, you know, Tom, I just want to talk to you. I just want to talk to Michael. Joe, I love talking to you too, but we have a connection because we've gone through something and we're trying to grapple with something that's a little different than a lot of people have to deal with. When I met Joe and Mike, it was at a support group meeting that was sponsored by the Brain Aneurysm Foundation in Boston. But I live in New York. I was on a family trip. I was with my husband and my son. We were going to a basketball tournament, which is difficult to sit through after having a brain aneurysm rupture just a couple years out. And I felt like I just needed to find some people that were like me. And Christine told me, well, you know, just so happens if you want to see some people, that we're actually having a support group meeting in Boston. And I found myself there, and I found myself connecting to 20 other people that I had never seen before, that I wasn't sure if I would see again, but in an instant, I felt like they know me, they know me. And I still stay in touch with several of the people that I met at that support group. We text each other, we send each other uplifting messages, we send each other uplifting songs, but we stay connected. And so I think that the support, I am a huge advocate of the support groups that the Brain Aneurysm Foundation sponsors, connects people with. They're vital to me. You need to be with people who can kind of understand, and your family is so wonderful, so supportive, but it's important for some family members, and my husband, quite frankly, has only been to one support group meeting that we've had here in the New York area, and he found it so humbling. I think he found that, you know, he was just blown away by the struggle that so many people have trying to recover from the surgery after a brain aneurysm rupture, or dealing with just contemplating what are the different treatments that I can pursue if I have an unruptured aneurysm. It's really hard to deal with. And I know Joe could speak to this better, but I think there's a PTSD that family members have that is very different than the ones that survivors have, but just as important and just as painful and just as difficult to get over. So the support groups can be very helpful for them as well, but it's kind of my safe space. So when I go to the meeting, I often go to the meetings by myself. My kids don't want anything to do with it. They don't want to remember any bad times, so they're not interested in going. And my husband will go if I ask him to go. But for me, it's my time, and that support group, those people that get me, it's the best time of the month for me a lot of times to have those meetings.
No, well said for sure. So Michael, how about you, bud? Yeah, what's the importance of providing support for patients and families?
Well, it's very important throughout the whole recovery of the brain aneurysm journey. So my family, my father, my grandmother, at times we all like to attend support groups hosted by the BAF, as well as the BIDMC, the Brain Injury Association of Massachusetts. And they're very crucial to survivors and caregivers as well. I mean, I go into the meetings and I always leave with tremendous amount of insight on whatever the topic was. Some topics vary from meditation to different tips to go through your recovery. And it's just awesome to hear what other survivors are going through. So my support and therapies, they've allowed me to go back to college, and I'll be soon completing my associates in human services. And through these groups, like I said, I always gain immense amount of insight. And one of my tasks during one of my courses at Bunker Hill, my internship was through the Brain Injury Association of Massachusetts. It was for me to develop a young adult support group through the BIDMC, which we have begun in January with 3 in-person meetings, but now due to COVID, it is all virtual. But it is great to see new members even coming in through these Zoom meetings as well. And everyone leads with a good message. And it's just really good to see all the work that I've gained through attending support groups through the BAF and now putting it into my work. And it's very uplifting there.
How about you, Joe?
Well, thanks, Tom. Initially, when this happened, my family and I, we didn't know what a brain aneurysm was, as we hear many times. With the support of the medical professionals, we were able to understand a little scope of the rehabilitation process ahead of us. After leaving Beth Israel, Michael was transferred to Spalding Rehab, and then in Charlestown, Mass. And then from there, he attended rehab at Community Rehab Care, a facility that specializes in brain injury recovery. There he attended speech, occupational, and physical therapy for nearly a year. During this time, my family and I, we relied on a network of organizations and support groups. We found them to be very helpful. We went to the Beth Israel, the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, hosted by Buckley. That's a monthly event, and it was tremendous help to us. We also attended Spalding's brain injury support groups held on Saturdays. And there we connected with other families and survivors of traumatic brain injuries in general. We continue to this day to attend as many support groups as possible to gain the insight and help needed to deal with this life-changing experience for our entire family. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. So, I know sometimes telling our story is a little difficult, but I am going to ask that of our 2 survivors now. So, Sharon, could you talk us through your experience from diagnosis to treatment to recovery, please, and share with us what you've alluded to it quite a bit this afternoon. What are you most thankful for today?
So I would say that September 21st, when my brain literally exploded, was the greatest blessing of my life, because it caused me to just have to stop what I was doing, stop what I was striving for, and refocus and prioritize what was most important in my life and what I really, really needed to be doing with my life. I was very busy at work. I am a TV journalist, and I had a lot of big interviews lined up, and I was filling in as an anchor for several shows. And before that, to get my body right, I decided I was going to go exercise. And that morning I went to an exercise class, and I am, again, not a super athlete. So I was in a yoga pose. That's my type of exercise. And I felt just the worst feeling in my brain. I don't know if I would call it a headache, because it was something that was so unusual that it was a greater pain or sensation than I'd ever experienced. And it was in the back of my head. And when I stood up, I said, I have to get out of this exercise studio, and I have to get out of here. And I went to my car, and then I realized I couldn't really turn my head. So I was like, I can't drive home. So I texted my husband. I told him where I was. He came to get me. And then I did something that everyone should not do. I went home. I should have gone straight to the emergency room, but I went home. I put my feet up. My husband ran out and got me Starbucks. That was supposed to make everything better. It didn't. I was nauseous. I felt terrible. And my husband said, let work know you're not coming in today. We're going to go see a doctor. And my doctor was actually not working that day. And the person on call, thankfully, had been an emergency room physician for many years. And he said that he just looked and thought, as Dr. Ogilvy said, what is the worst case scenario here? What could happen? And I was nauseous, and I was in and out of consciousness at that point. And he was like, you just have to go to the local hospital right now, and we need to get imaging. You need to see what's going on. When I went to the local hospital, my husband drove me. There was no time to, he said, is there an ambulance coming? And the doctor was like, no, this is my doctor's office. You'll be faster getting her there, so just go. When I got to the local hospital, they did a CT scan, and there they found bleeding on the brain. And that's kind of the only thing that I remember before going into surgery, was hearing that and knowing I need to contact my other family members and let them know, my sister, who I'm very close to. And I was able to speak with her. I was conscious enough to be able to speak with her and tell her myself what the doctor had said. And then I told her, don't tell my mom, who at the time was approaching her 80th birthday, and that's the last thing I wanted her to know about. But of course, we're a close family, so I'm sure she knew within seconds. That hospital was not equipped to do the craniotomy, the surgery that I needed, and to do all the angiogram, the imaging that I needed either. So I went to Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx in New York, and I had my surgery there with an amazing team. And what I find fascinating, and it is so minute to minute, it is so second to second, and this is why it's so tremendous that Dr. Ogilvy is actually on this call after doing surgery this morning for an unruptured aneurysm, but still every second counts. That I was at a 9 o'clock exercise class, and when I look at my post-op note, that neurosurgeon had completed the surgery before midnight. So all of this happened in the span of less than 24 hours, in the span of basically 12 hours. And that's how quickly it needs to happen often for your life to be saved. So I'm just tremendously grateful about that. And the next part is, as Dr. Ogilvy said, and thank you for understanding that you're just the tip of the iceberg, because the recovery is such a long process. 2 weeks in ICU, another few days in a regular hospital room, 2 weeks in a rehab hospital, and months of outpatient therapy, and therapy that continues today. Not working, not being able to work for a year, and returning to full-time work, I'm so happy, in July, almost 4 years later. So it's a long journey, and I'm so thankful for all of the medical staff that was there, at the professionals that I continue to call on, because it is a journey. I think it is a lifelong journey. It's not just a few days, it's not just those few hours in surgery. It is a lifelong journey, and but I'm so blessed and so thankful to be here.
Yeah, we all.
Yep.
Michael, but talk a little bit about your experience from diagnosis to treatment and recovery, and what you're most thankful for, please.
Sure. So, as many survivors will say, it's a very long recovery. For me, many ups and downs. Thankfully, now it's mostly ups. So I try to put any negatives aside and just look for the more positive look on life. So I don't really remember much of my rehabilitation stays at Beth Israel, Spalding, I guess kind of thankfully, but I don't really remember much of that. So what I do really remember is my outpatient treatment at a facility called Community Rehab Care, where they specialize in brain injuries, where I was involved with speech, occupational, physical therapies 5 days a week. And it was very intense, repetitive, and overwhelming at times. But looking back, I kind of needed all that therapy that I received, and I wouldn't be where I am today without that. And of course, today I'm very thankful for my loving family, friends, all healthcare workers around the world, the therapists I've had, and all of those involved in the brain injury recovery process. Thank you.
Well, I can tell you about, you and I met 3 years ago when I was in the early stages of recovery, and I know who I was then and who I am now, and I see who, how far you have come, and you're an inspiration. You're a real power of example. So
We all are.
Yeah, well, you're very modest as well. So you must have been raised the right way. So Joe, give me the caregiver perspective, right? What resources have been made available to you through the foundation, and how have they helped?
Okay, thanks, Tom. With the help of the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, my family and I received education with respect to brain aneurysm risk, the complications, rehabilitations, and realistic expectations. They provided us with resources such as reading materials, that were a good source in highlighting brain aneurysm awareness. A key resource became the network of support groups, as we had mentioned, available for survivors and their families. The support groups connected us with other families that had similar experiences. The Brain Aneurysm's website was extremely helpful. It was the first place we turned to get an understanding of what was happening and what to expect. In the days and weeks that followed Michael's brain aneurysm, the Brain Aneurysm Foundation website became one of our favorites, a place where we frequently visited to educate ourselves on what these new terms meant that we'd hear from Dr. Ogilvy: endovascular coiling, clipping, vasospasm, craniotomy, angiograms, to mention a few. It's still on our favorite list on all our computers, iPads, and cell phones. We're there frequently, Christine. You guys do a great job in updating the website. It's fantastic. Educating ourselves with Michael's condition on a daily basis was very important. It was a scary, stressful, and uncertain time for our family. The resources available through the foundation were comforting in providing us information on what to expect. Thanks.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So I do want to be respectful of people's time, especially our doctors, and Dr. Ogilvy, who is obviously he can be called back into surgery at any moment, right? And that's the uncertainty of this disease. So I want to go back to the doctors a little bit. And, so Dr. Ogilvy, let's start with you about some of the advancements that are being made on the diagnostic side and the care side that are currently underway, as we alluded to earlier. So really what I'm asking is, what are your hopes for the future when it comes to these medical advancements?
So the real hopes are, you kind of think fantasy land. What do we want? We would love ways to, first of all, non-invasively diagnose brain aneurysm in an inexpensive way. That would be a really great thing to do. Do we hold something to your head? Do you do a blood test? What is that? So we're continually have our eyes open for that. And then the next real advance would be, particularly for unruptured aneurysms, how likely is this to bleed? I said that some of the autopsy studies early on, many of the aneurysms found were not ruptured. Well, if you have an aneurysm, I would love to be able to tell you, look, this is the kind that doesn't rupture versus this is the kind that's more likely to rupture. There's a lot of work going on with that now in terms of the size, the shape, the hemodynamics, in terms of which look more likely to rupture, but we don't know if that's certain yet or not. But we may be, in the not too distant future, be able to, for instance, image the wall of aneurysms, so we know how susceptible someone is to rupture. These are things that are a little bit fantasy land, but somewhat on the horizon, that we look towards, which would help minimize the number of people who need treatments and maximize the prevention of hemorrhage. And then in terms of the other big issue, even today, is that still there's people who hemorrhage. We have no access to them until they hemorrhage. And as you all know, unfortunately, 20% of people grab their head and that's it. They never make it to the hospital. And those who make it to the hospital, there's still morbidity. We say morbidity, that is, they have neurologic deficits, and mortality, that is, they don't survive. So we have a bit of a disconnect there in terms of trying to prevent that. Once that does occur, we look towards people like Dr. Steffen-Sebastian Bolz in terms of minimizing injury from that hemorrhage. And that's where the BAF has put a lot of energy. Once a hemorrhage has occurred, how are we going to minimize the injury from that hemorrhage so that recovery is easier, recovery is better, recovery is higher percentage for more people? That's what we're looking for, really.
I think that's great. And you had already talked earlier about, 25 years ago when you and Dee Buckley were thinking about, hey, how can we help and build something sustainable? When you look at where you were then to where you are now, I think some of the things that you refer to are aspirational for sure, but not pie in the sky by any means. I think this is the way. And as Dr. Bolz, as Sebastian Bolz referred to it, unfortunately, the economy tends to run some of this stuff, right? So when you look at things like lost productivity and what have you, and you can put a dollar amount to not proactively treating, I would say smarter and better, I think we're going to get there. I truly do. And that's why we continue to do what we do. So, but I do want to go back to Dr. Steffen-Sebastian Bolz, who, if nothing else, has the best name, and I would argue hair in all of the research genres here in for brain aneurysms. What are your hopes for the future, Doc? And you are at the cutting edge of this stuff, and you and I have communicated quite a bit when you first received a Tinlin Chair of Research, which was terrific. And so you're at the cutting edge, and you're seeing how things are changing quickly. So tell me your hopes for the future when it comes to the medical advancements, please.
Yeah, I would like to add to what Dr. Ogilvy said. I think where we still have room to improve is to understand what's really happening shortly before rupture, during rupture, and after rupture. I think if we focus on that, this will teach us very important lessons. And so with the Tom Tinlin chair, because you just mentioned it, we actually looked at time of day differences with regard to the impact of the bleeding. And it has been known for quite some time that really depends on when during the day you suffer a rupture. The question is very simple. Why is there a difference? So how can we explain that you react differently at a certain point during the day as compared to the other one? And of course, what we do is always to look at the microcirculation. And what we found with the help of the Tom Tinlin chair, and what we actually now built a grant on Tom, that is really the continuum we've talked about quite a few times. We're actually writing it right now. We found difference, and we also found difference in the mechanisms that regulate these small blood vessels that I talked about before. And this is a complete new gate that we opened there. And trying to understand what's really happening there, what are the hemodynamics, and how might the microcirculation affect the pressure that actually pushes towards the aneurysm? That's a very interesting question. So we're trying to find out about this, and we're trying to understand this better. And we're of course not alone. I can only speak for myself, but I know that several groups are working on very similar questions. And the other point is, I think, and that what I've always believed in, and I see a lot of progress there, is the question: what happens molecularly? So whether it is the development of an aneurysm, and Dr. Ogilvy mentioned certain clustering with certain comorbidities and connective tissue disorders. So what is happening there, and can we correct this? What is happening in the microcirculation as to why? And we only have one candidate so far that we're kind of attacking, but there are more. So we need to understand, we need to read the code better. What is happening functionally? Because this is a structural disease at the beginning, but it rapidly turns into a functional deficit soon after. And we actually need to understand what's going there. And I think there's so much research going on that will kind of shed new light on this, that I'm very optimistic that we will have new treatment ideas, new drugs, and also kind of maybe new physical therapies that you don't even dream of. And I like the analogy with putting something to the head and look for aneurysms, right? Whatever that might be. I like that, because this is exactly what we're looking for. We have to be open, and we have to understand what's happening there in order to interfere with the downside of it.
So I appreciate that. So obviously I can hear, but I do think it's important for folks who may be, stumbling upon this webinar and this panel discussion, to understand that these grants, they're very competitive, right? In the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, we receive grant applications to fund certain levels of research. And then our medical advisory committee, which Dr. Ogilvy chairs and he referred to earlier, they go through each grant applicant and make some recommendations on what can be funded, which it's a challenge now, right? I mean, COVID-19 has sucked a lot of the available money out of, and people's ability to give, and on the charitable side, from doing that. But so is it safe to say then, Doc, and this might seem like a stupid question, but I think people need to hear it, that the Brain Aneurysm Foundation grant program is really important to yours in the research of others. And could you explain that a little bit on why that is so important?
It is definitely important. So as I said before, for me, it has always been important to get money to try something out. The granting system, as we have it from public agency, is more built on grants that create a continuum and where the feasibility is obvious. So grant committees, be it at the NIH or at the CHR or the DFG here in Germany, they're relatively risk averse. because they can be made accountable for the money they gave away if the thing doesn't fly at all. So this is maybe a very simple explanation, but it's kind of a motivation there. The Brain Aneurysm Foundation, and I've seen this in many of the projects, has been the opposite of risk adverse. There was interest to promote something new and to do something differently. And I think this is what makes it so important. And I mean, the grants are somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000. This is a lot of money if you invest it smart. And this is what we try to do. As I mentioned before, $10,000 can get you very far with a new animal model. A new animal model is a prerequisite for a grant application. And that comes back to the whole feasibility question of the risk averseness of grant panels, right? So the more you can prove with the money that we get from you guys, the more we can open, or the wider we can open a complete new door, the better for the subsequent grant applications. And we experienced this more than once, that the money we got from the Brain Aneurysm Foundation helped us to promote a completely new idea and demonstrate feasibility with preliminary data, because we could show this will work and this will be a good publication and this will help patients and so on. We could actually, you have to go through all these steps, right? They have checkboxes for this. So you have to kind of serve all of this. We could have never done this without the money from the Brain Aneurysm Foundation. At the end of the day, it's a very simple mechanism, but this is the spark that lights a fire. And there would be no fire without the spark.
Terrific. Well said. So just a couple housekeeping matters, and then we're going to go right into our closing remarks. It's going to be a very quick round robin. I'd ask people just to keep your closings to less than a minute. But we would, a couple of things. You've heard a lot about the Brain Aneurysm Foundation website, and somebody did refer to it earlier, but bafound.org. Again, bafound.org. Just a whole bunch of information for our patients, our survivors, our families, survivors. It's all right there for you. So we encourage you to go to bafound.org. And we also want to really give a heartfelt thanks to the City of Boston Credit Union. So the City of Boston Credit Union, our friends who have been huge supporters of the foundation over the last several years. The City of Boston Credit Union has made possible this Brain Aneurysm Awareness Month panel, and we thank them for that. But now, again, so on to the round robin, and I'm going to go in reverse order. And less than a minute, I'm talking to you, Dr. Bolz, when I say that too. But we're going to start with Joe O'Leary. Joe, give me your closing remarks.
Thank you, Tom. It was an honor and a privilege to be here with you all and sharing some of our stories and so forth. And I'll be even less than a minute. And here's the thing. We're all in this together.
Love it.
There's the hat. That's what it means.
There's the 18 right there.
Yeah.
Michael,
That's right.
thoughts, my friend.
Yeah. Thank you.
You got it. Michael, what do you got for me, bud? Give me some closing thoughts.
Well, as we know, the research has come very far way in just the 6 years since my aneurysm, and I'm just glad to see. I just don't want people to have to go through what we went through, and it's coming so far to the point where that all of these aneurysms should be beatable once detected. So it's good to see how far science is coming, and I want to thank everyone for participating and listening.
Well done. Well done. Look at that. Geez, bookends. You guys are the best. All right, Steffen-Sebastian Bolz. What do you got for me? Give me some closing remarks, my friend.
I can do it in 10 seconds to make good. I want this hat. That's it. No, seriously, it has been an honor and a privilege, and I think that should raise awareness. I think not what the researchers and doctors said, but what the survivors said, and what we kind of discussed together. Because for me, it leaves me with this warm feeling that we do something that makes sense, that's important, and that will help others. And I think that this feeling is important. And I think this is what it's all about. Of course, promoting research and everything, but I think those panels, those ideas, those exchanges, they ultimately change things and thinking. I think that's great. And it's a privilege to be part of that.
Well said. And we're so happy that you could join us. Sharon Epperson, you're up.
You know, I have goosebumps, and if I keep talking, I might start crying. But I was clapping for the O'Learys with their wonderful hats. I need one too. I think what my final thought is that I just want everyone to know that we're in this together. Whether you are a physician, whether you're in the medical community, whether you are a patient, you're a family member, you're a survivor, or if our hearts are with you if you've lost someone to this terrible disease. We are all here to help one another. And I think that's what's so beautiful about this organization, that we really are a team working together on all fronts to make sure that this disease, that there's a cure, that there's a way to prevent aneurysms. And I'm so happy to be a part of it. And I'm so happy that I found my people. I have found my people. And it's the new Sharon's people, right? So I've added to my family, and it's been a wonderful experience. And I hope if you're watching this, you're joining our family too, because we are here for you. Reach out, bafound.org. Reach out.
Terrific, terrific. Dr. Ogilvy.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for doing this and for having me as part of it. But there's a couple of things. Every time I listen to the stories of patients and families, I get more out of it. And Sharon touched on something that was one of the cornerstones of forming the foundation. In addition to research and information and education, it's support. And patients can say things and do things for each other I can't. I mean, I've operated 4,200 aneurysms. I've treated another couple thousand endovascularly, but I still haven't had one. And that's a powerful tool, and it helps a lot of our patients. We also, in reference to Washington, do have one individual running for president who had a ruptured and an unruptured brain aneurysm, Joe Biden. So recovery is possible, and watching Mike and Sharon and hearing their stories is incredibly moving. But I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this.
Thank you, doctor, and thank you for taking the steps over 25 years ago to make it possible. I hope you know that for each person that you touch, that number grows and grows, and it benefits our family, our friends, our colleagues. It's truly remarkable. So our fearless leader, the woman, when she calls, you gotta step up and answer the phone and answer the call. Christine Buckley, how about some closing thoughts from you, please?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing, it's as terrible as brain aneurysms are. I mean, for me, I'm honored to be executive director of this organization. It offers me a challenge every day for everybody that does work here, because there is so much to do. So it's great to get up and know I have a full day every day. But as awful and terrible as brain aneurysms are, they have led me to all of you. And that's just on this panel, but everybody that that will listen to this. I mean, I'm missing from this month. I'm normally traveling all over the place, and it's what really fuels me and fuels the staff if they travel with me. It's when we go to events and we meet the people and we hear the stories. And we truly are a team. The organization is all of us. And we can't do this alone. So I'm just appreciative of everybody here, because from everyone that I meet and get to share time with, I learn so much and get so much back. So thank you.
So thank you all very much. This wraps up the Brain Aneurysm Awareness Month panel brought to you by the City of Boston Credit Union, the Brain Aneurysm Foundation. Again, you've heard it before, bafound.org. We thank Coleman Nee from the City of Boston Credit Union, who was on standby to make sure that I didn't touch any of the wrong buttons and all that kind of jazz. But look at, for those who have symptoms, go get screened. Go get screened. Don't take no for an answer. Advocate for yourself, because it is through your voice and through your actions that we will continue to change the tide and change those really scary numbers that we talked about. This is treatable, and it's treatable in less invasive ways if it is identified before it ruptures. And the survival rate, the recovery rate, all of those things just get better. It has been my true honor to moderate today, both as a survivor and so maybe I could run for president, Doc, right? I have a rupture and I have another one, so I think I have the qualifications, but you all have been great. Sometimes it's not easy to share our stories, but in sharing our stories, I like to think that we're giving people the information that they need to save their or somebody else's life. So thank you all very much. Thank you, City of Boston Credit Union, Brain Aneurysm Foundation, and we'll see you all soon.